Good evening, and welcome to HM News Special Report. I'm Professor Donna Brazile, and tonight we're diving deep into one of the most fascinating periods of English history, the Tudor era, specifically the complex relationship between two half-sisters who both wore the crown of England. We'll be analyzing the historical documentary Why Bloody Mary Hated Queen Elizabeth I, Two Sisters, Absolute History, a production that attempts to rehabilitate the reputation of Mary Tudor while exploring the intricate dynamics between Mary I and Elizabeth I. This documentary challenges the traditional narrative that paints Mary as a bloodthirsty tyrant and Elizabeth as the Golden Queen, arguing instead that history has been unfair to the elder sister. To help us separate historical fact from popular myth, we're privileged to have with us one of the world's most distinguished historians, Professor Niall Ferguson of the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, author of numerous acclaimed works on empire, power, and historical narrative. Professor Ferguson will provide his expert analysis on what this documentary gets right, where it oversimplifies complex historical realities, and what crucial nuances it may have overlooked.
Thank you, Donna. Before I begin my analysis, let me say that I approached this documentary with considerable interest. Any attempt to reconsider received historical wisdom deserves attention, particularly when it concerns figures as mythologized as the Tudor queens. However, as a historian, my job is to evaluate not just the intentions behind such revisionism, but the accuracy and completeness of the historical picture presented. The documentary's core argument that Mary Tudor has been unfairly maligned by history while Elizabeth I has been excessively glorified contains substantial truth. The producers are absolutely correct that Elizabeth and her propagandists were extraordinarily successful at shaping historical memory. The Elizabethan era was indeed the age of spin before spin was invented, and Mary's legacy suffered enormously as a consequence. What the documentary does well is humanize Mary Tudor. It shows her as a woman of principle, educated, determined, and facing impossible circumstances. The portrayal of her traumatic adolescence, separated from her beloved mother, Catherine of Aragon, stripped of her title, forced to serve as a lady-in-waiting to her infant half-sister, is historically accurate and genuinely moving. These experiences profoundly shaped the woman who would become queen, and the documentary is right to emphasize this formative trauma. However, and this is crucial, humanizing Mary does not require us to minimize the very real horrors of her religious persecution. This is where the documentary begins to falter. The documentary spends approximately 90 seconds on the burning of 287 Protestants during Mary's 5-year reign. It attempts to contextualize this by noting that the 16th century isn't noted for kindly monarchs, and that Mary isn't alone in having killed people for their religious faith. This is technically accurate, but profoundly misleading. Let me provide the context the documentary omits. Mary burned approximately 284 people in just under 4 years, from February 1555 to November 1558. This averages to roughly one execution every 5 days. To put this in perspective, her father, Henry VIII, executed approximately 81 people for heresy over 38 years. Elizabeth I, during her 45-year reign, executed approximately 183 Catholics for treason, not heresy, though the distinction was often technical. The intensity and systematic nature of the Marian persecutions were unprecedented in English history. What made them particularly shocking to contemporaries wasn't just the number, but the method, burning alive, and the victims. Unlike earlier heresy persecutions that targeted clerics and intellectuals, Mary's campaign deliberately included common people, weavers, apprentices, pregnant women. The burning of pregnant women was especially horrifying to English sensibilities. The documentary's narrator states that Mary hadn't expected that she'd need to burn so many and really felt that a few would set an example to the rest. This is accurate, but it reveals a catastrophic miscalculation that the documentary doesn't sufficiently explore. Mary's religious persecution wasn't just morally wrong by modern standards, it was politically disastrous by contemporary ones. It failed to achieve its objective and instead created Protestant martyrs whose stories, immortalized in John Fox's Acts and Monuments, would poison Mary's reputation for centuries. The documentary presents Mary's marriage to Philip II of Spain as primarily emotional, a woman seeking to recreate her mother's dynasty and reward Spanish support. This psychological reading has merit, but it misses the sophisticated political calculation involved. Mary faced what historians call the Tudor marriage problem. As the documentary correctly notes, she couldn't easily marry an English subject without elevating him above the nobility, nor could she marry a foreign prince without appearing to subordinate England to a foreign power. However, the documentary doesn't adequately explain why the Spanish match was uniquely inflammatory. England in 1554 was experiencing what we might call an identity crisis. The break with Rome under Henry VIII had created a nascent English nationalism that was both Protestant and anti-Spanish. The Spanish Inquisition was already legendary for its cruelty. Philip's father, Charles V, was the most powerful ruler in Europe, controlling Spain, the Netherlands, much of Italy, and the Holy Roman Empire. English people feared, quite rationally, that marriage to Philip would reduce England to a Spanish satellite. The documentary mentions the advantageous marriage treaty that limited Philip's power, but it doesn't explain that this treaty was almost immediately violated in practice. Philip did indeed pressure Mary into England's participation in the Habsburg-Valois Wars, which resulted in the catastrophic loss of Calais in 1558, England's last continental possession. This loss was perhaps the greatest humiliation of Mary's reign, yet the documentary barely mentions it. The documentary handles Mary's false pregnancy with appropriate pathos, presenting it as a personal tragedy that changed everything. This is accurate, but there's a deeper historical question that goes unexplored. Was Mary delusional, or was she deceived by symptoms of ovarian cancer? The documentary suggests cancer as an explanation, which is medically plausible. However, it doesn't address the political implications of Mary's apparent inability to distinguish between pregnancy and illness. In the 16th century, a monarch's physical health was viewed as a sign of divine favor or disfavor. Mary's phantom pregnancy wasn't just personally humiliating, it was politically catastrophic because it suggested that God himself had rejected her and her religious project. Moreover, the documentary doesn't adequately explore how this event transformed the political landscape. Elizabeth, who had been living under what amounted to house arrest, suddenly became the inevitable future. The phantom pregnancy marked the moment when the court began its slow pivot away from Mary toward Elizabeth, a shift Mary herself painfully witnessed. One area where the documentary is commendably balanced is its treatment of Elizabeth during Mary's reign. The question of Elizabeth's involvement in the Wyatt Rebellion of 1554 remains one of the most controversial in Tudor history. The documentary correctly notes that what we don't know is how much Elizabeth knew about it, and that she protests her innocence repeatedly and vehemently. This is historically responsible. We genuinely don't know whether Elizabeth was actively plotting against her sister or was simply the unwitting figurehead for Protestant conspirators. What we do know is that Elizabeth was a survivor with superb political instincts. She understood that her very existence was a threat to Mary's regime. and she navigated this impossible situation with remarkable skill. The documentary's portrayal of her writing a desperate letter to Mary from the Tower is accurate, the famous Tide letter in which Elizabeth begged for an audience with her sister. However, the documentary perhaps oversells Mary's mercy. Mary didn't spare Elizabeth out of pure sisterly affection. She spared her because executing Elizabeth without clear proof of treason would have made her a martyr and potentially sparked a civil war. This was political calculation as much as conscience. Now we come to the documentary's most problematic claim, that Mary was the true groundbreaker for female monarchy, and that Elizabeth merely inherited and amplified her sister's achievements. This argument requires careful examination. It is absolutely true that Mary was England's first crowned queen regnant, and that she established crucial legal precedents. The documentary is correct that Mary passed legislation confirming that a queen regnant possessed all the authority of a king. This was indeed groundbreaking, and Elizabeth benefited from it enormously. However, the documentary's claim that Mary encouraged British explorers to go to Russia, the Baltic, and America, and that Elizabeth took what her sister Mary had started and made it her own, is a significant overstatement. Mary's reign saw some commercial exploration, particularly the Muscovy Company's ventures to Russia, but these were private merchant initiatives, not state-sponsored projects. The systematic development of English naval power and overseas exploration that characterized the Elizabethan era was qualitatively different. Moreover, the documentary's suggestion that Mary was very, very interested in expanding British explorers sits oddly with the fact that Mary was trying to restore England to the Catholic fold. Catholic Spain and Portugal had claimed exclusive rights to the New World under papal bulls. Mary's alliance with Spain would have made aggressive English exploration diplomatically impossible, even if she had desired it. Here's where I must disagree most strongly with the documentary's thesis. While it's true that Mary faced extraordinary challenges, the problem of female rule in a patriarchal society, religious division, an absent husband, failing health, it's also true that she made crucial political mistakes that had nothing to do with these structural disadvantages. Mary's greatest failure wasn't that she was Catholic. Many English people retained Catholic sympathies. Her failure was that she couldn't separate her personal faith from political reality. She genuinely believed that burning Protestants would save their souls and restore England to the true faith. This wasn't simply cruel, it was politically incompetent. Elizabeth, by contrast, understood that religious uniformity was impossible and that attempting to enforce it would tear the kingdom apart. Her famous statement that she would not make windows into men's souls reflected not indifference to religion, but political genius. The Elizabethan religious settlement was deliberately ambiguous, allowing people to conform outwardly while believing privately what they wished. The documentary presents Elizabeth as a more skilled propagandist than Mary, which is true, but it underplays the fact that Elizabeth was also a more skilled ruler. She chose better advisors, William Cecil, Francis Walsingham, Robert Dudley, and actually listened to them. Mary surrounded herself with conservative Catholics who reinforced her most destructive instincts. The documentary's most valuable contribution is its reminder that historical memory is constructed, not discovered. Elizabeth and her ministers were extraordinarily successful at shaping how their era would be remembered. The cult of Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, the defeat of the Armada, these became founding myths of English identity. Mary, by contrast, has been remembered almost entirely through hostile sources: John Fox's Book of Martyrs, Protestant propaganda, and Elizabethan historians. The documentary is right to encourage us to look beyond these sources and ask what Mary's reign looked like to contemporaries, particularly Catholic contemporaries. However, and this is crucial, recognizing that Elizabeth's reputation is partly myth doesn't mean Mary's poor reputation is entirely myth. Mary burned nearly 300 people alive. This isn't propaganda, it's documented fact. Her marriage to Philip was politically disastrous, not because marrying a foreigner was inherently wrong, but because she chose the wrong foreigner at the wrong time, and then failed to maintain English independence within that marriage. One significant omission in this documentary is the broader European context. Mary and Elizabeth weren't simply sisters competing for power. They were actors in the greatest ideological conflict of the 16th century, the Reformation and Counter-Reformation. Mary was attempting something that was succeeding elsewhere in Europe, the Catholic Restoration. In Spain, Italy, and much of Germany, Protestantism was indeed being rolled back. Mary's mistake wasn't in attempting this, it was a plausible policy, but in failing to recognize how differently England's break with Rome had unfolded compared to continental Protestantism. England's Reformation had been top-down and political rather than bottom-up and theological. Henry VIII had created an English Catholic Church without the Pope. Edward VI's ministers had imposed Protestantism, but it was still relatively shallow. Mary's restoration of Catholicism might have succeeded if she had lived longer, married an Englishman, and produced an heir. The burnings made this impossible. Elizabeth understood that England needed religious peace, not religious purity. Her genius was recognizing that national unity trumped theological consistency. The documentary's title promises to explain why Bloody Mary hated Queen Elizabeth I, but it never quite delivers on this promise. In fact, the evidence suggests that Mary's feelings toward Elizabeth were far more complex than simple hatred. Mary certainly suspected Elizabeth of involvement in Protestant conspiracies, with good reason. She certainly resented Elizabeth as a symbol of Anne Boleyn and the break with Rome. But hatred? The evidence doesn't support such a strong claim. Mary spared Elizabeth's life when her counselors urged execution. She kept Elizabeth close to court. She even, according to some sources, expressed hope that Elizabeth would convert to Catholicism and marry a Catholic prince. Elizabeth's feelings toward Mary are even more enigmatic. She carefully maintained an appearance of Catholic conformity during Mary's reign, attending Mass and professing loyalty. Whether this was genuine or political calculation remains debated. What's clear is that Elizabeth learned crucial lessons from observing Mary's reign. Don't alienate half your kingdom over religion. Don't marry a foreign prince. Don't let personal faith override political judgment. So what's my final assessment of this documentary? It succeeds in its primary goal of complicating our understanding of Mary Tudor. It correctly identifies her as a woman of intelligence, principle, and determination who faced extraordinary challenges. It rightly notes that Elizabeth's lowing reputation owes much to successful propaganda, and that Mary's awful reputation has been exaggerated by Protestant historians. However, the documentary fails in its apparent secondary goal of suggesting that Mary was essentially Elizabeth's equal as a ruler, merely unlucky in her historical circumstances and in her propagandists. This is revisionism too far. Mary was not simply a victim of bad press. She made catastrophic political decisions that destroyed her regime and poisoned her legacy. She chose religious purity over political stability. She chose a foreign husband who brought England nothing but military defeat and diplomatic humiliation. She persecuted with an intensity that shocked even her own age. These were choices, not circumstances. Elizabeth, conversely, wasn't merely better at public relations. She was a more skilled politician, a more pragmatic ruler, and a more successful monarch by any measure. Her reign saw England transform from a second-rate power on the periphery of Europe into a major player on the world stage. She managed religious conflict without tearing the kingdom apart. She navigated the dangers of female rule in a patriarchal age with remarkable success. The documentary is correct that Mary paved the way for Elizabeth legally and constitutionally. The precedents Mary established were crucial, but precedents aren't the same as success. Mary proved that a woman could be crowned Queen of England. Elizabeth proved that a woman could rule England successfully. Let me end by saying that despite my criticisms, I'm glad this documentary exists. Historical revisionism, when done responsibly, is valuable. We should constantly re-examine received wisdom, look at evidence with fresh eyes, and consider alternative interpretations. Mary Tudor deserves to be understood in her full complexity, not as a one-dimensional monster, but as a woman of faith, determination, and tragic choices. Her suffering was real. Her challenges were genuine. Her failures were catastrophic. Elizabeth I deserves to be understood beyond the mythology, not as a flawless icon, but as a supremely skilled politician who made difficult compromises and cruel decisions when necessary. Her success was real. Her propaganda was effective. Her legacy was earned. The truth, as always in history, lies not in choosing between competing narratives, but in holding multiple truths in tension. Mary and Elizabeth were both victims and agents. Both suffered and inflicted suffering. Both shaped history and were shaped by it. Both deserve our understanding, though not necessarily our absolution. That's the lesson we should take from this documentary. Not that Mary was secretly good and Elizabeth secretly bad, but that history is more complex than our simple stories allow. And that complexity, ladies and gentlemen, is what makes the past endlessly fascinating and relevant to our present.